Welcome to Post Truth and National Security, a kind of impromptu interview with Gary Geipel. And Gary is the senior associate at the National Institute for Public Policy and the director of the doctoral program at Missouri State University School of Defense and Strategic Studies. And he has been doing some research on the question of the post truth environment and how it affects national security. I'm Dr. Dave Hayes from Troy University, and we're joined by my colleague, Dr. Clifton Sherrill, also from Troy University. And we are kind of interested in the challenges of this truth environment, which we're about to get into, for both our students and for policymakers and basically our students when they graduate and go out in the world and try and give advice. So, Gary, Cliff, welcome and glad to have you all here. I will put one disclaimer here that Troy University, the National Institute for Public Policy, and Missouri State University have neither approved this content, and the views expressed here are ours, not necessarily theirs. So everybody get off our back. So, welcome everybody. What is post-truth?
Well, yeah, first of all, thanks to you, Dave, and to Cliff for having me on this conversation. It's a great opportunity, and yeah, I'm somebody who deals with students all the time too, and they're my primary focus. So glad to be part of this university-based effort. Well, what I call the post-truth information environment is actually something that a lot of folks who might be listening to this would consider normal, and it kind of falls to a somewhat older guy like me to notice that it's actually not normal in terms of the way things always were. It's a big, I would argue, dangerous step back from uh, what into what was normal some time ago, but we thought we had made progress. And what I mean by that, as a society, we're increasingly, at least where information is concerned, we're behaving like our prehistoric ancestors did. And what I mean by that is, we're all surrounded by information. We always have been to one extent or another. And there's basically two ways to engage with all that information. Um, the first, that has worked reasonably well for a while, which I would argue is the old normal, is to look for facts and truth in the midst of all that information, because information does not equal truth. Uh, and I think that's been pointed out very well recently in a book by an Israeli historian, Yuval Harari, book called Nexus, which I highly recommend. So that's sort of one way of dealing with this information environment, is to look around, try to make sense of the information that's around us, try to determine what's actually a fact and sort that into something that approaches truth. There's a second approach, which is what I would argue has become our new normal, and that is to basically conform to your tribe's dogma / ideology, reject facts that don't fit that, not recognize truth, let alone seek it, to basically accept the easy answers that are given to us. And I think more and more folks, even in supposedly advanced societies such as ours, are following that second path. And you see evidence of this, and we can get into where it's coming from. But starting in middle school and high school already. And I want to make clear right from the outset that I don't see this as a partisan political thing. I think some people who talk about these issues immediately get into, well, it's the other side's fault. It's all the MAGA right, or it's all the woke left. I try scrupulously to avoid that, because in my work and everything that I've seen, I just don't believe it's a distinction. I can argue. I can give examples from one side. I can give examples from the other side, and they're in many cases almost mirror image. So I want to be clear from the outset. I'm not bringing a political message here, or condemning one of our two big tribes in the U.S. I want to talk more about this issue of how we relate to information.
Okay, and I think in your paper you you emphasize three things. One is the role of narrative in our understanding of the world, that increasingly people are uh, have a narrative about the way the world works, and they're trying to get information to fit in that narrative and rejecting things that don't. Also, there's tribalism, the division of people into social groups, which each have their narrative. And so we have competition and conflict between these groups. And then you also talk about entrenchment, how this information environment is being entrenched and supported by things like media, social media, politics, and other factors, right? So those were the three things you were talking about there. How do we get here with this?
Well, I would say two words as an overview: quickly and unexpectedly. And I say quickly because there was a truth, and still is. I don't want to make it sound as though it's gone away completely. There has been a truth-seeking approach that worked pretty well for 250, 300 years roughly since the what's called the Enlightenment, at least in the West. This period coincided with tremendous breakthroughs uh, uh, in terms of how we understand and make sense of the world. Uh, it it included this the scientific revolution that we associate with a lot of progress. And what I mean by this, our current situation has arisen quickly, is that in just really the last 2 decades, in my view, uh, a lot of the emphasis on that way of understanding the world has been diminished, and that's what I talk about in terms of what you've just called entrenchment. Uh, that our behaviors are not, which are normal in some ways for people to want to have quick answers to what's going on around them. The correctives that have been in place for a lot of time, or for a reasonable amount of time, are getting weaker. And it's things like peer review in science. It's things like objective journalism, free speech, civil discourse. These were all sort of markers of this period of the so-called Enlightenment, when we sort of learned how to adjudicate our differences and understand the world in a way that makes everybody's outlook more effective. That has really diminished. And I used, in addition to this happening fairly quickly, I say unexpectedly, because um, the thing that is most associated with the collapse of Enlightenment truth seeking is something that actually was supposed to help us, and that is the rise of the digital realm. It was I'm old enough to remember when the internet took off, and even social media. The hope was that that this would be a gift to truth seeking, because it would make it that much easier for us to get our hands on the facts, have things at our fingertips that we needed to know to make decisions, and that it was the perfect medium for reasoned debate and citizenship. But unfortunately, it did not work out that way. The social part of social media has dominated completely, and the digital realm became a realm of silos that were built up around us. In some cases, we don't even know that we're in them, but these silos have the effect of assuring us that this steady diet of conforming, sort of reinforcing information that we all get is in fact the truth. It gets back to what I said earlier about it's this sort of reinforcement of dogma and ideology that we get inside these social media silos. And it is it's as if we're back in those tribes of old. So that's where I bring up the tribalism piece that you mentioned. And just to recap there, what the way I sort of organize this is, increasingly we focus on these ideologically driven narratives about how the world works. This is reinforced by the tribes that we're in, that are particularly accentuated on social media, where we only hear from people who tend to see the world the same way we do. And then there's no correctives. That's where the entrenchment comes in. There's no correctives from these institutions that we built up so painstakingly, like uh, uh, peer review, like objective journalism, like civil discourse. And so the result is, more and more of us that are, simply just bought into these very rigid views of the world that actually are not accurate in many cases, and lead us down some dangerous paths.
So, Cliff, we've gone a long time before we've even heard your voice here. What do you see in this? What are because you're the one who found Gary's article and suggested it to me. So, what are your comments on what we've talked about so far?
So I think this is a really important thing, not just for students, but for society at large, as Gary was saying earlier. I think it really affects our politics in this country. And I don't think the danger is necessarily new. While I was listening to Gary, I was thinking back to the Federalist Papers and Madison writing about the dangers of factions and factionalization. And if we have these rigid, always aligned factions one against another, then the public good suffers because the primary motivation becomes defeating the other faction. And I was thinking about how that kind of ties into the tribalism piece, that those could be very similar ideas. Um, the I guess the biggest problem that I note is, how do we overcome this? And I don't mean the problem with the paper, I mean the problem for all of us at large. How do we overcome where we are today? And I think all of us will probably end up at the same place, and that's with the education system. At some point, there's got to be change where we're educating students early on, not just at the university level, in terms of recognizing the difference between opinion and fact. And I would suggest that I think this is a problem that's been arising or building even longer than the 20 years Gary suggests in the education system, where the focus has been so much on everybody has a right to an opinion and egalitarianism, and your point of view is as good as anybody else's. And I think back to Tom Nichols' book, The Death of Expertise, where he's very forcefully making the argument everybody's opinion is not as good as everybody else's opinion, right? The opinion of the uneducated individual just spouting half truths or non truths or post truths, if we can use that as a noun, um, are not as good as an expert in the field. And I think we have to get back to that recognition of expertise and appreciation of expertise to say, yes, this expert's opinion, this expert's knowledge on something is worth more than this ideologue or uh, demagogue who's just giving opinion.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I would, if anything, argue that what I'm calling post-truth actually goes a bit beyond that. Opinions. I mean, I agree with you completely. Some are more informed than others, but the way I understand opinion is, it consists of uh, sort of weaving together facts in a way that supports your view of the world. So it's like a fabric that has, some serious weaving in it of information. What I would argue about post-truth in some cases, and what we're seeing increasingly today, is, it's beyond opinion. This is, facts be damned. In many cases, these are invented realities, and we can talk about some examples that are around us, but that almost concerns me even more and goes beyond. I mean, absolutely, the factionalism in our politics has always existed. It always will to some extent. But I think even, the writers of the Federalist Papers would have acknowledged that they were, competing with others who organized facts in a different way. They weren't competing with people who basically invented an alternative reality, which is what I think increasingly we're seeing in some of our tribal silos.
Well, I think, I go back to this uh, idea that when we talk about beliefs about the world, statements about what we're talking about truth, right? That your beliefs about the world can be about understanding reality, right? Just trying to be able
Right.
to say what exists. They also serve a psychological role in terms of positioning yourself in a world and contributing to ontological security. And there's also a social role where you are understanding others and yourself with regard to them. And a lot of the stuff that seems to be just very to a lot of us who are in kind of a reality appraisal mode. When you tell us that there's a pizza shop that has got these kids that's enforcing child prostitution and cannibalism, right? And we hear absurd stories, and we go, well, that doesn't make sense, right? Democrats eating the brains of children doesn't make sense, and is very discordant and that's an extreme example, of course, but the people that promote it, if they're promoting a vision of themselves and others, um, it it gives this idea that, hey, I am, telling a story about these other people that I kind of want to believe. It makes me feel good. But also, when I promote it to other people and they agree, I'm signaling to them my membership in
Exactly.
their group, right? And that's the social role, right? So the
Right.
psychological role is you hear something negative about people you don't like, and even if it turns out to not be true, it still makes you feel good, right?
Right.
And you're like, yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds like what they do. But also, you're kind of getting this message from other people that they agree with your worldview, and they're signaling the membership. And so when we get to these psychological and social roles of beliefs, I think that's where a lot of this stuff is coming down. And I think when you talk about the past, I mean, I'm not so gung ho, or I'm not as committed to a view that there was great rationalism prior to, in the late 20th century, but there was a consensus. You had three news channels, and so the evening news would be kind of everyone would partake in it, and you couldn't necessarily pick sides in that, right? The medium couldn't pick sides. The medium had to present stories that could be accepted by everybody. And as you mentioned, the siloing, the stovepiping, the echo chambers allows us to move in a very different direction than we had before from and so there's a lack of a consensus. And I guess my point is there probably was a consensus view, a overarching narrative that things are being framed in at the time, and it's just the monopoly broke. Right now we have these competing narratives in a more more contentious manner. But that's kind of what I see here. But what do you think the implications are of this for national security?
Well, I would, I guess, start a little bit more broadly than that. And even though national security is my main focus, but I, I think it's helpful to sort of talk about the big picture a little
Hmm.
bit. And there's three big pieces, I think, in terms of consequences. One we've already started to talk about, which is what I would call the decline of citizenship and communities. Uh, our fellow citizens, in many cases are increasingly no longer regarded as people we might disagree with about some things, but we basically respect and want to work with the tribalization component of this. Suddenly uh, they're evil or stupid creatures from another planet, and and I mean another planet almost literally. That's where the sort of alternative reality piece gets in when you're trying to have a discourse with somebody who's got an entirely different and potentially made up fact base. It becomes very hard to find the common ground on which citizenship is based, and that starts at the community level in neighborhoods and goes up to what we're seeing in Washington in recent years, which is almost the inability to get things done. And that, I would argue, is the second big consequences, which is the decline of, I guess, governance, for a better word. Our political and social leadership is worse and worse at at getting stuff done, or even doing their their basic jobs, because again, that has typically depended on bringing a basically shared fact base and view of the world to the table, and that's very hard to do. And so you can see this in Washington, where we struggle just to keep government running at times, where we at the most basic level are not getting things done, like funding key agencies, and we're throwing money at fantastic ideas on the one hand, or pie in the sky, and leaving tangible crises unaddressed. We're having this conversation. I realize people may be seeing this a while later, but we're having this conversation as there's some major fires going on in Southern California, and I think that has led to some, I think, useful conversation about the consequences of government having focused on pie in the sky, and not maybe done enough to do the basics of preparing for things that should be no surprise, and such as fires in Southern California. So that's the second set of consequences around the decline of governance. And then I would say the third is with regard to innovation. On the one hand, we think, oh, we live in this world of fantastic technological breakthroughs, and things seem to be changing around us. But I would argue we should actually be doing much better. If you look at biotech, energy, climate mitigation, space. I mean, if you had told the Gary Geipel of 1969, that we would have, that so little would have happened, certainly on the space front, but on those other fronts as well, I would have hardly believed it. The Gary Geipel of 1969 was watching a moon landing carried out with technology that anybody's iPhone would supersede today. And yet, despite the blessings of this information revolution, we haven't made that much progress. And I would argue some of it does have to do with the fact that increasingly more and more of our sort of young people, our most educated and promising individuals, are caught up in sort of battles over reality, rather than in this sort of scrupulous grappling with what's actually true, what actually adds up, and what could amount to an innovation if I followed it through. So those, for me, are the three big picture consequences. And let me shut up there, and happy to go more into national security if you'd like.
Well, I think, the big problem with narratives, is, a narrative, if we wanna get into what it is, it situates, our current situation in terms of a recent history, identifying the antecedent events that are most important, and, because some things can be more important than others. And it identifies protagonists and antagonists, laying out their, laying out their motivations and their presumed relationship to making decisions and going forward. And the thing about it is that, what I see as a big issue is, um, if the narrative becomes in some way sacrosanct, right? If your view of the world is doing something that it's either psychologically supporting you, or it's socially supporting. By the way, groupthink goes to that, right? Groupthink brings up that idea that in a group of decision makers, you can, you know, get a narrative and a framework for understanding the world that is constraining, right? And it can be a problem. The trick is, do you then start not interpreting, do you start filtering information? Do you start disregarding information? And I think, Michael Flynn had this big problem, right? There's a reason that he was, you know, kind of put out of his original role in national defense intelligence agency, in that he was somebody who very much had a narrative about the world and only wanted to have information, and his staff knew this, and they started collecting what they called Flynn facts, because when they found a piece of intelligence they knew he'd like it, and so he started pushing a narrative, and the rest of the folks around him were uncomfortable with it, amongst other things that he did. And that, my understanding is, that was one reason he was moved out. But that becomes, that to my mind emphasizes our danger in national security,
Right.
is letting a narrative, being unaware that there is a narrative,
Right.
and being unaware of its effects, and uh, potentially having a narrative that is, constraining. Also, in terms of political communication, not recognizing the other narratives that people have, that, that your arguments for or against something, your justifications, if you're in public diplomacy and you're trying to explain why you should defend Ukraine,
Right.
right? What's the narrative there? And, does your narrative of the war in Ukraine start with the invasion of Ukraine? Does your narrative start with the annexation of Crimea? Does it start with the breakaway, the separatist movements in Donbass? Or do you go back to the overthrow of the previous government through the protests, right?
Right.
And, and which is where kind of Russian narratives start talking about how the government's illegitimate, and all. And so, recognizing the different narratives that different people have, I think is important. And so I think those are some of the implications. The question are, what do we do about it? Cliff has suggested greater emphasis on critical thinking and education, which might be a tough sell to the current crowd out there, by the way. What other things can we do about it, for our students and for policymakers?
Well, yeah, I mean, education is key. And there, I mean, I may be on a hopeless path here, but I would want to say to anybody who, uh, frankly, even if there is an ideology or a view of the world that you believe is, absolutely true, and you want to get across to your students, you're not doing your students any favors by indoctrination, which is what I think too much of education, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, amounts to. If you believe in something, if you believe in a view of the world, then, and you want others to, help advance that belief, then at least educate them in a sophisticated way on what the criticisms are. What's the pushback? Help them to understand and be able to argue other points of view. It'll make them stronger in advocating for your side of things. So let me just start with that as a caveat, so that no one thinks I'm just trying to push one side of it here. But absolutely education, and I would argue it really, in terms of building defenses against uh, alternate realities and the post-truth information environment, needs to start in middle school, certainly no later than high school, because that's already when everybody's got one of these things, and they've entered the tribe, and they need to, at that point, already have some grounding in skepticism, and being able to sort fact from fiction, in understanding what constitutes a reliable, truthful source, and what constitutes a manipulator or a propagandist. Uh, so that needs to start very, very early, because the longer someone exists in these silos, the harder it is to bring them back out. And I've actually tried to sort of live up to this, and piloted a course at the high school level. And I hope I'm not being um, silly or naive here, but I've actually, and I mean this completely, have tried to stress to young people that this in the world we live in, your ultimate superpower is your ability to make these distinctions. I mean, because I truly believe that understanding what's actually happening being able to move towards the truth is still the route to success, whether you define that as financial success, social success. Uh, and so to have that ability to sort fact from fiction and to understand who's trying to manipulate you and who might actually be a source of useful information is a legitimate superpower. And so um, I think that may be the way to approach it with with maybe the next generation that's coming up now, uh, and really instill these. And I would hope, again, perhaps I'm naive, but I would hope this is something that educators could agree on, regardless of their own larger worldviews. This is not something that's going to hurt conservatives or hurt progressive liberals. This is something that could help anybody who wants to see their ideas move forward in a serious and fact-based way.
Well, one comment I want to make, it goes back to national security, if you'll allow me, before answering your question about education. I think one of the most dangerous implications for all this from a national security standpoint is the complete fractionalization of the American public, and the vulnerability that that entails to a foreign actor who's acting under an authoritarian government, while we're laboring under the some of the fragility of democracy.
Right.
So the siloing is the term we've used before, the tribalism, the falling into these various little, and they can often be very narrow niche uh, belief systems, echo chambers, given the huge amount of sources on the internet, strange little
Right.
clubs for every single thing. That I think that removal of an underlying unanimity, an underlying sense of what it is to be an American, is very much at threat. I've asked students in classes before, what is American nationalism? And some of them are unable to answer. They don't know what's the animating idea that brings us together, peoples
Right.
of different ethnicity, religion, historical background, and such. So I think that's a huge national security vulnerability.
Yeah.
Um, Getting back to the education question, I very much agree with the things that Gary has talked about. Teaching the scientific method, skepticism was the word he uses, which is absolutely essential to the scientific method. Separating fact from fiction, and that's where I was, what I was discussing earlier with the idea of, I think in the schools, the focus on egalitarianism has led to opinion being elevated, and the ability to discern fact from my opinion has been devalued. So we've got to stress those two things and say, everybody has the right to an opinion, but everybody does not have the right to their own set of facts.
Right. That's a
Um,
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, thank you for that.
right, right.
yeah.
Although in some ways there's that rejection of the idea that there is just straight fact. And, I think part of the post-truth environment is that we've kind of gotten away from an understanding of when we are talking about facts. But yeah, I think the critical thinking, the problem is that, one, there's I'm going to come in with the answer that the scientific approach is what we want, right? That we want to say, hey, the way William Riker, not the guy from the Enterprise, the guy from University of Rochester, my mentor, he said, I asked him what the essence of what we do as political scientists is, and he says, well, when we utter a sentence about reality, we do something to prove it's true. And I then immediately said, I thought you said we didn't prove anything. All right, we test whether it's true. Shut up, Dave. Uh, Go figure. I pissed the guy off. But nevertheless, I think that statement stuck with me. That hey, we're going to offer things up as propositions to be tested. So we're skeptical. That
Right.
I describe myself as a devout agnostic, which is meant to be a little bit of a joke. But the difficulty in that is there are cherished truths that people don't want to treat as simply hypotheses, and that they don't want to have. And so it leads you into a lot of discomfort. And so getting out of academia into other discourses can be, I think, a little problematic in that. And I don't know what we do about that. Um, but I think in our role as educators, I think the emphasis on, hey, we're going to test ideas. Okay, we haven't solved many problems here today, but interesting discussion here, things raised. I want to thank both of you, Cliff, as always, and Gary. It was good to get to know you, and so I hope you'll have some more writings on this subject in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it, and hopefully it does help to inspire some folks, because I think personal commitment and courage is at the heart of this as well. People just willing to step up and say, I'm going to approach these questions differently. I am going to be evidence or fact based, and I think it says a lot about the school you both work for, and hopefully the one that I'm associated with. That I think these, if anything, these sorts of discussions are more likely to happen at the sort of smaller, under the radar institutions, rather than those that have been more ideologically captured, so to speak.
Cliff, is always good to see you. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.